Well, I'm a marine physiologist. I've been working on sharks and the relatives for a long time. I study how hormones regulate their reproduction. And since many environmental pollutants affect hormonal systems, I also study how environmental pollutants may impair shark reproduction and health.
What sort of pollutants are in the marine environment?
Well, tons of marine pollutants are out there, and you really only need to decide which pollutant you want in order to be able to measure it, because our ability to measure things is so good these days. In particular, some of the pollutants that can affect sharks are the ones that are persistent and long-lived. Ironically, they're some of the ones that we've already banned already, things like organic chlorine pesticides, polychlorinated biphenyls, and also some of the other pesticides that we use pretty regularly. But some of those aren't that persistent. Now, I also study some what we call pollutants of emerging concern, things like human pharmaceuticals, which make their way into the environment through wastewater treatment.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that there are some chemicals that we've known for decades that they're bad for the environment, they're already illegal, and they're still affecting sharks?
Well, they're still affecting anything, but really a lot of these things have been banned for a long time because of their persistence and their toxicity to both human and wildlife populations. A good example are the PCBs. These are things that were used extensively as agents in transformers, also in electric capacitors, and we learned later that they're very toxic and that they hang around forever. So these things really tend to accumulate in marine organisms, particularly those that are at high levels of the trophic chain. But it's very difficult for us to really do anything about them because they're already in the environment, they're already locked into the sediment, and in areas where there's been a high degree of production of these compounds or runoff of these compounds in local habitats. These are areas that could be of concern for accumulation into local populations.
All right. You mentioned fertilizer as one source of some of these chemicals. What are others? Where do these come from?
Well, a lot of these things, like I said, since they are already banned, they were a product of their high use in past years. So things like the industrial chemicals, of course, will leach out of some of their components. Some of these things were released in high quantities near the production plants. Of course, you would have something like organic chlorine pesticides were just applied in the atmosphere. But some of the new pollutants that we're most concerned with are the ones that enter through wastewater treatment. They're things that we would like to remove, and certainly the wastewater treatment facilities would like to as well, but they're more polar. So wastewater treatment facilities are very good at trying to grab things out that bind to stuff, that stick to things. A lot of these things, like the drugs that we take, are water soluble, which means they can kind of get through the processes that would normally pull out environmental pollutants.
So these chemicals are already passing through some sort of waste treatment facility, and they're still getting through into the environment.
Sure, and we have to blame for this as well. So it's not something that we can just point our fingers at the wastewater treatment facility so much as realize that things like we've studied, Prozac in the environment and other antidepressants, and we found them to be not necessarily high concentrations, but at least present in the blood of bull sharks and freshwater rivers, let's say. Some of these things make their way into the environment really because we're using so many of them. And the main way they get into the environment is through us excreting them, and eventually them making their way through the wastewater and getting past some of the processes again that we use to try to pull environmental pollutants out before we actually discharge this in the environment.
All right. You mentioned that these can affect some sharks' hormonal systems. What kind of impacts can that have, other than you mentioned the reproductive system? Are there other impacts?
Well, there's a lot of this is very theoretical. So we know from laboratory studies on other fishes, I would say more so than sharks, that exposure to sublethal concentrations of some of these chemicals, and I'm going to use an example of ethinyl estradiol, that's the synthetic estrogen that's found in birth control pills. Those can have effects on the animal that alter their endocrine system, and some studies have shown that in some experimental lakes in Canada, that if you distribute this ethinyl estradiol into the lake at levels that we would find in, let's say, a highly contaminated wastewater treatment area, that you can reduce reproduction in the population to the point of where the population will crash. We don't know if this is occurring in sharks. They're exposed to these compounds. A lot of the populations are probably a little bit more immune to other fish populations because, of course, not that many sharks move into fresh water as much as, say, like the bull shark. That's one of the reasons why we were interested in the bull shark with regards to wastewater treatment. So we're still at a very early stage with sharks. We know that they can have cell level, molecular level effects on the animals, but we don't know about the big picture effects on population effects, for example. But theoretically, they should be able to, or capable of altering reproduction and ultimately population growth.
All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about your research or environmental pollutants or anything?
Well, the main thing is that what my lab really focuses on these days is to try to find out whether or not we can more concretely develop cause and effect relationships between pollutant exposure and sharks in our population. In other words, can we go into an area that someone believes is polluted with contaminant A, for example, and say, we've tested the blood, we've tested the liver, and yes, you're correct that the levels of this pollutant in this area are not just high, but high enough to actually cause a change in the physiology of the animal, and kind of work our way up the level. So change in the physiology, is there a change in, for example, reproduction? Is there a change in health? Is there a change in population growth? So that we can develop really strong tools to be able to really narrow down this, because without that, we kind of end up twisting in the wind a bit about saying that, well, you know, the shark population may seem to have poor health, but we don't necessarily know what the cause is. We really need to come up with better cause and effect relationships.